Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Out of the Corner of Your Eye, Volume 2, Story Number 1. I work overnight security, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. at an upper-class retirement/nursing home. The building I work in was recently built and opened in January. Adjacent to where I work is the oldest building on the campus, being constructed in the 60s, which is the nursing home portion of the community. As you can imagine, this building has seen a lot of death and has numerous ghost stories. This building is in the shape of an L, consisting of the west and east wings. Currently, the west wing of the building is completely barricaded due to them removing asbestos, as they plan to demolish this building in roughly a year's time. The east wing is still active. Around 9 p.m., an hour into my shift, I'm sitting at the front desk watching Twitch streams, as usual, and I receive a phone call on the desk phone. This phone does not receive calls after 8 p.m., and they are directed forward to the nursing supervisor on the east wing of the nursing home. On the caller ID, it read RRCC3 West, the third floor of the west wing of the building that is barricaded off. I thought nothing of it and let it ring. 5 minutes later, another call. I answer security. On the other end, all I hear is faint background noise, and from what I can recall, very faint breathing into the phone. I give it a few seconds and repeat, "Hello? This is security." Nothing. Hung up, kind of freaked out. I called one of the other more tenured guards that I worked with and told him what happened, and he tells me, "That is very strange. Maybe call the nursing supervisor to see if anyone could have possibly gotten to the west wing." I take his advice and give her a call, and I tell her of my experience. She replies, "Sweetheart, there is no way you could have gotten a call from the west wing. All the phone lines over there are disabled." I explained to her in exact detail what happened. At this point, she seems about as freaked out as I am. We have a little laugh over it and part ways. Later into the night, probably right around midnight, I kind of have a little less tense feeling about it, and I'm just trying to forget, while playing a game on my laptop and watching a stream. We have a 2-monitor setup, one for whatever we want and one for the camera system. The area I work in is on the first floor with an open floor plan above me, leading down the hallway into common areas. All of a sudden, I hear a loud thud from above. I looked up, not expecting what I was going to see, then quickly looked at the cameras to my right. A picture had fallen off the wall right above me. I go back to the camera system to watch the recorded footage of what happened. It just falls off the wall. These pictures are back taped, not hung on a nail. So I guess it could have been a coincidence and the tape gave out. But boy, did it freak me the hell out, happening on a night like that. I've been there for a few months, and this was my first real experience. And I'm hoping my last. Story number 2. I work at an old Franciscan campus. I work housekeeping there and have changed shifts a few times. And I've worked in nearly every building. This story happened in the summertime. Several of the buildings here were used to house friars, and the building this incident happened in is no exception. The building had its own separate chapel and 4 floors of rooms. But the floor plan is strange. Narrow hidden hallways and tunnels, a hidden courtyard and stairwells that connect to only certain floors. It's very easy to get lost. We were cleaning rooms on the second floor, the haunted one. There had been a friar camp. Joking casually about the ghost and what it would do, everyone had a story about this building. To save time, I'm going to list the ones I can remember quickly. Unplugging equipment, scratching, whispering, sinks turning on their own, objects thrown, full-bodied apparitions, loud bangs, and crying. That covers the whole building. It kind of freaked me out hearing this, and I tried to ignore my feelings of dread. The last room that I was working on was on the furthest end from the stairs. Opening the drawers, I happened across a rosary, a saint medal, and a Latin prayer book. Not odd, except the friar that had been in that room left the camp early. I told my supervisor, hoping they'd pick the items up. No such luck. I had to walk them to the chapel, which meant walking down a flight of stairs and then going through a tiny hallway. Walking through the hallway, I noticed that several of the doors were padlocked, shut. It seemed strange, but honestly, I wanted to hurry up. When I entered the chapel, I set the items down as quickly as I could and turned to leave. I noticed that there were more padlocked doors, and the walls had Latin on them. I took Latin in school, so I started to read it out loud. I figured, why not? When I got to a word I couldn't pronounce, I paused and expected the echo to as well. Except, right at the word I was having difficulties with, a raspy whisper spoke it in my ear. I turned around hoping it was a coworker, but I was alone. Running to a door, I pushed and tried to get it open, but it wouldn't budge. One of the other padlocked doors started to shake violently, like someone was trying to break in. I shoved the door again and it opened. I ran back to the second floor where everyone was and refused to wander alone again. And I'm sure you understand why. And next story. I'm currently in my 20s, but this story's been developing for, about 70 years. When I was younger, the events I'm about to share used to scare me, but now that I'm older, it's something I just kind of live with. These are the first-hand accounts from myself, my friends, and my family regarding the house I currently live in. Based on the age of neighboring homes, we estimate our house was built sometime in the late 1940s with a Cape Cod-esque design. The housing development we live in sits on top of an old shale mine. It was a former property of a coke iron ore company, both dating back to the late 1800s, which of course isn't a surprise, as coke ovens dotted the ridges everywhere here in western Pennsylvania for well over a century. With so much history on the property, perhaps it's no surprise that there is at least some activity. However, most of the hauntings we have encountered seem to go far beyond the history of the land. My father bought the property in the early 1980s. A single father to my 3 step-siblings, he moved his business from Fayette County up to Greensburg, hoping that a change of scenery would do them well. As my father's business began to thrive, my brother and 2 sisters were all working for the company between going to college classes. Most of the time, the 3 of them were in the house for most of the day, as my dad had opened up a room in the house to be used as a sort of satellite office. From the beginning, though, there was a sense of discomfort with living there. Perhaps the emotional stress of the recent divorce of my dad and his wife had a good deal to do with it. But there was something else, a feeling that cannot be described in the physical realm. As ominous as that sounds, perhaps the realtor who sold my dad the house had really given a forewarning. He said that the house had been owned by multiple families, most especially in the last few years leading up to that day. And my father asked why there had been so many different owners. He was supposedly told they couldn't take the constant hauntings. In fact, he continued, the house had not been blessed by priests, but an exorcism was performed at the request of the last owner. Of course, my dad, a few years removed from the military and toughened as a result, said he wasn't concerned about ghosts that didn't exist. As it stands today, he couldn't have been more wrong. It's hard to know where to start, but I'll try to recall the events in a semi-chronological order. My brother and 2 sisters roomed in the adjoining upstairs bedroom across the hall from my dad's room. The first few months, they would hear tapping noises and voices coming from the attic cubbyhole, which in Cape Cod-styled houses is level with the second floor. While it seemed strange, my siblings usually ignored it, being implored to do so by my dad. However, things began to get strange after about a year in the house. They would occasionally see shadows move from room to room, but usually brushed it off as seeing things. Doors opened and closed on their own, but those were usually cast off as drafts of air in an old, drafty house. Yet, the occurrences began to escalate further. Their house cats would stare intently at a random point in an empty room, hiss, and then run frantically around the house as if being chased by something purely mean and aggressive. The TV in the living room began shutting itself off and on, increasing volume to full blast on its own and flipping the channel to dead air, fuzzy or black screen with white noise. Sounds of glassware clanging in the kitchen would be heard, only to be left unexplained when explored by my dad and siblings. Even more bizarrely, cold glasses of ice would turn up all over the house, even while no one was home for days prior. And those are just the common occurrences. The unique stories still give me chills. My brother Todd was taking a shower between classes in the middle of the day when he heard the front door open and close. It has bells attached to it, so it makes a distinct sound. Both of my sisters were away, so he assumed it was our father. While he found it odd that my dad would have come home from work so early, he brushed it off. A few minutes later, he heard the bathroom door open. "Hey, Dad," he said. Moments of silence passed. "Dad?" he questioned. Figuring that Dad was pulling a fast one, he ripped open the curtain just to see that not only was he the only one in there, but the door was still closed. Perplexed but unfazed, he closed the curtain and continued showering. When he finished, he went to pull open the curtain again. This time, however, he felt something solid on the other side. Freaked, he yanked the curtain open again, and of course, he is the only person in the bathroom. Shocked beyond belief, he darted out of the bathroom, ran down the steps to the front door at the bottom. Seeing it was locked, he yelled for my dad. Not only did he not get a response of any kind, but my dad was still at work. No one was there. A few weeks later, he left the house swearing to never return as a result of his encounter. To this day, he hasn't. Yet, most of my siblings' encounters with the paranormal revolved around my sister Lisa, mostly after my other two siblings had already moved out. On multiple occasions, she would see a tall, dark mass travel through rooms and walls late at night, but that was the least of her worries. The experiences began to get physical. One night in particular, she was awakened by a little girl's laughter. Assuming she was dreaming, she had to blink a few times to make sure she was awake. As she went to roll over on her side to look around the room, she discovered she was paralyzed from the neck down. It wasn't paralysis in the typical sense. However, she could slightly move her limbs. Rather, it was as if something was pinning her down. And she also claimed to have been very short of breath. Much to her dismay, when she looked out of the corner of her eye, she saw a child dancing in a circle in the middle of the room. She tried to scream for help, but again she was very short of breath. She finally mustered up enough energy and breath to let out a very loud scream. Yet my dad, who was and is still a very light sleeper, didn't hear her in the room next door. All she could do was close her eyes and hope it would go away. It didn't. After a half hour of agony, she finally let out yet another scream. This time my parents did hear her. They rushed into the room and found Lisa in a cold sweat, still unable to move. She was rushed to the ER, where doctors had no idea what would have caused such a physical anomaly. What shocked them even more, though, was when she snapped out of her paralysis completely without medical explanation. What happened a few weeks later, however, would not only scare her more than that night, but would drive her out of the house for good, much like my brother. Lisa was getting ready for class when she heard the TV turn on in the living room. She figured someone had come home, not really thinking anything of it. After a few minutes, however, it got louder. Curious, she went downstairs to check on things. She looked all over the house. She was alone. A little spooked, she shut the TV off and headed back upstairs. She reached the top step when the TV turned on again. Now really freaked, she raced downstairs to shut off the TV. This time, it wouldn't shut off. At the same time, the kitchen cupboard door started slamming, the garage door started slamming, and even more alarmingly, papers and other objects began flying down the steps. Unable to go anywhere due to being surrounded by this paranormal activity, she frantically called my dad. Hearing the commotion in the background, combined with Lisa being hysterical, he immediately rushed home to find the house in complete shambles, and Lisa pale white. She left the house a few days later, and has only entered the house 3 other times in the 30-plus years since then. The spooky occurrences never really stopped after that, but seemed to subside slightly after one night in particular, when my parents had friends over to the house for a party. One woman who attended was skeptical that such an unassuming house would have so much activity, and in general was a skeptic of the paranormal. She mocked the spirit, saying, "If you really exist, come home with me." A few days later, she called my parents, telling them something was in her house that she couldn't explain. It's hard to tell what became of the woman, or if the spirit still resided at her residence. What became clear, though, is some of the spirits may have indeed left my house because the activity decreased significantly. That is far from where the story ends, however. In many regards, things would get worse. After my father was elected to the Pennsylvania State Senate in 1988, my parents spent most of their time on the road, mostly in Harrisburg. While the reports of activity obviously decreased, since they were rarely around, They would still occasionally come home to find objects disheveled and misplaced. At the turn of the decade, though, the events would become more and more common, starting with my birth in 1992. We traveled home from Harrisburg just after the blizzard of 92 had run its course. I was obviously too young to remember much of anything, but my parents were presented with a bit of a surprise when we got home. Sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor was a tub of ice cream. It was overturned, and much like the ice water found around the house in the years prior, completely unmelted. What was even more bizarre was the fact the freezer door was closed. This started a string of strange occurrences over the next few months, such as the self-aware TV again, rattling shutters on the windows, etc. Overall, though, the majority of major haunting had seemed to cease. Problem was, they actually hadn't. Because that's around the time when experiences involving me began to occur. My parents didn't always bring me with them on the road. In fact, many times I was put in the care of my mom's friend, Tina, who would usually house sit or place while looking after me. She would always complain about strange noises, cold spots, and the like, but she was never really truly affected by it. One night, in the mid-90s, however, she was sleeping in a bed next to mine when she woke suddenly from a deep sleep. She sat up, looked around, and saw a figure standing by the door. Thinking it was me, she called out to me and received no response. She said, "Come back to bed," but immediately got chills when she glanced over and saw I was still in my bed. When she turned back around, the figure was directly at the foot of her bed. It was a translucent figure of a young boy in colonial clothing, with pale skin and disturbingly no eyes. Obviously, she freaked out. By the time she ran over and grabbed me, the figure had disappeared. She brought me downstairs, and we stayed there until morning, with the lights on. What adds to the credence of her account is that it took place in Lisa's old room, where she spotted a little girl dancing around the room years before. Tina vowed never to return, and has followed through on that promise. Meanwhile, that would remain my room until I was about 15 years old. At first, I was never bothered about being in the room, but as most kids are growing up, I wanted my nightlight on all the time. Nothing significant really occurred to me directly until I was about 11 or 12, when I would have a series of experiences I will never forget. The first time I had a direct run-in with this paranormal, I woke up from a deep sleep and saw a large dark mass hanging over the side of my bed. I couldn't move, and it felt as if I was lifted up off the bed. Before I could scream, something, the best way I can describe it was a serpent-looking figure, lurched out from the black mass and dug right into my side. My back arched, and I could feel my energy and breath being drained out of me. I was trying to scream, but nothing was coming out. The mass then dropped me back down to the bed and crept back in the direction of the attic door. I repeatedly tried to scream for my parents, but I was so out of breath it was as if I was whispering. After about 10 minutes, I finally got enough strength to scream for help. Right at that moment, something I hadn't noticed that was off during the whole ordeal came back on. The fan next to my bed. My mom came running and asking what was wrong, and I couldn't even describe to her what had just occurred. For the next few days I was fatigued and my ribs were incredibly sore, so I know for sure that what I saw wasn't a dream. A few weeks later I woke up mid-morning, it was a weekend, and felt very strange, as if I was being pushed down. When I tried to move, just like my sister years before, I was paralyzed, but again, not in the typical way. I could move my limbs slightly, but I was completely pinned down. I tried to scream out for help, but there was nothing coming out. Terrified and struggling for at least an hour, I forced myself to go back to sleep. I woke up a half hour later, in my estimation, extremely sore but able to move. When I told my mom, she tried to explain it away, but the look on her face told me she knew something wasn't right. Shortly thereafter, I began getting severe fevers every other month, and with these illnesses came horrifying hallucinations, where my heart rate accelerated to such a high level my mom thought I was having a heart attack or a severe seizure. These hallucinations were shockingly realistic, and each one involved death. Many of them were repeated night after night, the most common one being me free falling to earth above my house. I could see my neighborhood on the way down. As I approached the ground, a dark red hole with a black ring around it would open up where my house was, and the closer I got to it, the more I would feel as if I was on fire. After I entered the burning hole, I would find myself being sucked into a huge iron furnace, and as I reached the inside, my eyes would shoot open. I would see my mom kneeling next to me trying to calm me down, as I would apparently be in cold sweats with screaming tantrums for 20 plus minutes before I would come to. Even more disturbingly, she would always come in and find me in a different corner of my room during these hallucinations. A few months later, I woke up with 3 scratch marks on my back, the pattern of the mocking of the Trinity, which I still have a small scar from. Shortly thereafter, a change overcame me, seemingly overnight. To summarize, I don't remember much of my age, 12 and 13 years. When I checked out our old camcorder years later, I found self-recordings of me rambling gibberish for long periods of time in my room. Completely incoherent talk. And do I remember any of it? Not in the least. Shocked, I erased the recordings immediately thereafter, not wanting to experience a side of me I had never personally seen, and certainly couldn't explain. I wound up doing a church cap trip in February of 2006. The best way I can describe it is whatever was possessing me was driven out during a very spiritually charged church service, where I actually felt something leave me and then fainted. After that, I was compelled to finally move my room downstairs, and we turned my old room into a storage room. While this ended many of our experiences, things still happen. Once, while talking about the hauntings with a friend, a potato in a cellophane bag next to our countertop popped out of the upright bag and rolled to the middle of the kitchen floor, stopping on a dime. An automatic toothbrush in the upstairs bathroom turned on inexplicably multiple times. A wire was somehow cut in the light switch box next to the front door, shutting off power to the entire house in the process. The sound of doors opening and closing still happen. Glassware from the top shelf of the pantry gets lined up neatly and upright on the floor on occasion. A bird kept ramming itself into a window for weeks, an omen of death and folklore. The window location? My old room. My friend from Boston who mocked there being spirits in the house was scratched while he slept. Items have flown off the walls of my room into the middle of the floor. Objects disappear, then reappear in the same spot days later. Our stereo will turn on by itself and switch to white noise. Male voices are still heard from the attic, and I refuse to go to certain parts of the house, especially at night, because of an overwhelming feeling of being watched. I have even had out-of-body experiences and nightmares of the demon children while in my current room. It's obvious my house still has activity, but it is much less frequent and, in my opinion, a little less sinister. I feel as if the crucifixes we have lining the house have helped, as well as much stronger personal, emotional, and spiritual state we're all in as a family. But that doesn't change the past of a property which has seen more than its fair share of hauntings. It's up to you whether you take our experiences as truth or not. But after 30 plus years of hauntings involving numerous people, I don't think we've been imagining things. Next story. I'm the eldest of 3 siblings, and of course, as we moved house to house, I got the basement bedroom most times. I was fine with this. Being the eldest, this let me have my privacy. The last home I lived in with my family, before I moved out on my own, I spent 5 years in the basement bedroom. Through those 5 years, I experienced amazing night terrors and sleep paralysis on a very regular basis. There were a few incidents where I would wake up and the closet on the far side of the room would be open just a crack, and I'd stare at it knowing I had closed it, and it would creak open just a touch more, then after what would seem like hours slowly close and click shut. Not a slam, not a regular door close, a very slow methodical one, if that makes sense. On 2 specific nights, I woke up, not suddenly like something jarred me, but just kind of rolled over and at the foot of my bed saw a girl standing there. She looked very young, black hair, dark dress, and she did not move, didn't make a sound, and I never could make out her face. Both times I referred immediately back to being 5 years old and hid my face under the sheets while my heart rate went full marathon pace. Eventually, I would feel like it wasn't there anymore and I'd peek out and it'd be gone. My parents are not believers in anything paranormal, and I never told them anything thinking they would think I was crazy. I chalked it up to night terrors and extraordinarily realistic dreams during paralysis. I moved out and far away. My next sibling in line got the coveted adult room in the basement, and life went on. I had a few Christmas visits and other holiday runs. At one point, I remember going into that room to get a chair and seeing the closet door nailed shut from the outside. I didn't question it, as I thought there's no way it's related to my experience. Not long after that, on another return visit, I went and checked the door to that closet. The nails were gone, but in place was a padlock, and there was clearly bundles of sage sweetgrass hanging above the closet and above the only exterior window. I worked up the nerve to ask my mom what's the deal with the basement, and she reluctantly told me that my brother had seen things coming in and out of the closet and that he had a girl appear beside his bed and terrorize him on several occasions. Now, no joke. I still haven't told them what I saw because I don't want them to have to move or be bothered with their basement over this. They're both retired. All kids have moved out, and they seem happy. They have also since gutted and renovated the whole basement. I've stayed there a few times now with my wife, and nothing has happened. So far. Next story. So, I got home from my job as a server at midnight. One of my roommates was in the Navy and was deployed at the time, and the other one was at his girlfriend's house. I cooked myself some dinner, and as I'm cooking, my dog starts growling and barking towards the middle of the room at nothing. This is especially weird because she never ever barks. She was a rescue, and I bought her as a sense of security when I'm home alone. I'm a girl, and I would never get her to bark at anyone anyway. I dismissed her barking as odd, but I finished cooking and ate. I started to clean and turn the sink on because it takes forever to get hot. But right when I turned around, the sink turned off on its own. Again, I thought that's odd, but I didn't really think it worth freaking out over. The hair on the back of my dog is standing up straight, but no one's home and it's midnight, so I figured I'd just tough it out, even though I was beginning to get a little spooked. After cleaning up, I went to the bathroom, sat on the sink to pluck my eyebrows. My bathroom was small, with a sink immediately to your right as you enter, with a toilet next to it, bathtub at the end, and toilet paper dispenser directly across the toilet. It was a really narrow room, so you could reach the toilet paper while sitting on the toilet. So the way I was sitting, the toilet paper dispenser was behind me. After 2 or 3 minutes, I hear a weird noise behind me, and I turn around, and guess what? The whole roll of toilet paper is unraveling. Just unraveling, like someone was pulling it. I got the hell out of that bathroom. The door was closed, and it had no windows, so it couldn't have been a breeze. I put a leash on my dog and ran out of that apartment faster than I could ever have thought possible. By the time this happened, it was around 2 a.m. None of my friends were awake, so I spent the night sitting outside the door to my apartment. When I went back in the next morning, the whole roll of toilet paper was on the ground, and the roll was probably 3/4 full. I'm talking about a good 5 or 10 meters of toilet paper. After that day, I never had an odd experience quite like that one ever again. But one of my roommates did mention that a few times he'd come home and find every door and cabinet in the place open, when he'd specifically remembered closing them and leaving them the way when he left. This was when I was on vacation out of state and our other roommate was still deployed. Next story. Army base, SOS, West Germany. A still dark autumn evening. Must have been warm because it was the kind of temperature you don't notice. Anyway, I'm 13 and my friend he's 15, and we're just hanging out before having to go in. Behind the flats where we lived was a green area with a play area. Only one street light, so it was very dark compared to our street and the well-lit main route through the camp, which is about 80 to 100 meters away from where we were walking. No traffic, nothing. It was never busy, and this was on a weekend evening, so literally no traffic and no one out and about as far as we could tell, which suited 2 teenagers just fine, thanks. Bear with me, this is important. So we're heading between our respective blocks of flats and into the darkened park area. And we stopped dead. On the main road, moving right to left, was a figure, vaguely person-shaped, but undulating and waving like cloth underwater. It glided along the middle of the road. Based on what it obscured behind it as it moved, I'd estimate to be about 8 to 10 feet in height, but at the very least it was larger than an average man's size. This shape, this thing, was not walking. There was none of the slide up and down motion of walking. It just glided smoothly at a fast walking pace, I'd guess. And it was black. Not someone wearing black clothes black. It was a hole cut into the night. No reflections, no shadows or shades, just blackness. It seemed like a lifetime as I soaked this detail up. In reality, it couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 seconds. I whispered or breathed, "Do you see that?" My friend in a whisper replied, "Yes." And then the effing thing changed direction towards us. The last image I have before we broke and ran was of it rising up as it came over the curb. This is what makes me think that it was real. This is something that had mass, that obeyed at least something of the physical world. It moved from the brightly lit road onto the same darkness in which we stood. We broke and ran for our lives, back into our street and into my mate's block. He then bolted back into his house, leaving me wondering how the hell I was going to get over to my block. After a while, the fear of the repercussions from my dad for being late overrode my fear of what might be out there in the night, so I ran. I straight ahead the 10 or so meters to my own front door. I was in too much trouble for being late to ever say anything when I got home. Sometimes when I'm walking and the night is warm and still and quiet, I think about it and wonder what did I do if I ever saw it again. Run away? Or face it down and maybe solve a 30-year-old mystery? Honestly, I just don't know.